John Lennon is dead, shot several times by a young American as he was going into his home in New York. The former Beatle, who was 40, was returning home from a recording studio with his wife, Yoko Ono, when he was murdered. It was just before 11 o'clock last night when they were entering the luxury Dakota apartment building on New York's west side. The attacker, named by police as David Chapman, aged 25, from Honolulu, shot Lennon with a revolver after an argument. Mrs. Lennon called for help. Residents in the building came to her aid. Mrs. Lennon accompanied her husband to hospital, but he was dead on arrival. Crowds quickly gathered outside the apartment block as news of the murder spread. Some among them said the arrested man had been hanging around the building for some days. Police said the gunman had got John Lennon's autograph earlier in the evening. They said it wasn't uncommon for people to wait at the entrance to the Dakota because many celebrities lived there. According to the police account, the gunman fired 5 or 7 shots at Lennon.
And Mr. Lennon was struck several times. We're not positive at this time as to how many times he was struck. He went up the stairs. There are 5 steps that lead up into the watchman's area of the Dakota. He went through that area into an office inside, where he collapsed to the floor.
Police say the motive for the murder is not clear, but they've described the man they arrested as mentally unbalanced. A police car took Lennon to the Roosevelt Hospital, where doctors said he'd been hit several times. He was dead by the time he arrived. Lennon's body was taken from the hospital for police examination, and a search was being made of the suspect's room at a block in another part of the city. All night, crowds, many of them weeping, waited outside Lennon's home, showing the reverence in which the founder of the Beatles was held by more than one generation. John Lennon's songwriting partner, Paul McCartney, says he can't yet take in the news of his death. He said John will be missed by the whole world. George Harrison also said he was deeply shocked at the news. And Ringo Starr, who was on holiday when told of his death, has flown to America and says he's extremely shocked. Anger at John Lennon's murder was expressed by George Martin, the man who worked with him as producer of most of the Beatles' records. He was asked by Gavin Hewitt how he saw John Lennon's contribution to the group.
He was very much one of the fundamental parts of it. He and Paul, of course, wrote most of the music. And the Beatles were a unique quartet because they each contributed a great deal to each other, and the 4 of them became larger than the individual parts. They were a tremendous team, and John was very much part of that team and a very creative member of that team. His astringency lent a great deal to the sweetness of Paul, and it was an incredible combination.
What sort of musician was he?
Well, by the standards of great musicians, he wasn't a great musician, but he was a great man. I mean, he was one of the originals of this century, no question about it.
The Beatles made Liverpool the centre of the British pop music scene in the early 60s, and their influence is still felt there, as Richard Duckenfield reports.
Liverpool's Cavern Club was the cradle of Beatlemania 20 years ago. They became the most popular of a whole host of Liverpool groups who performed at lunchtime and evening sessions. The site was turned into a car park after the warehouse that housed the cavern was demolished, and the only reminders are a statue paid for by Beatles fans and a new club on the other side of the street bearing the famous name. His aunt's house in the suburb of Allerton was John Lennon's home for most of his boyhood after his parents separated. But there's little evidence left in Liverpool of those early days. Some Beatles songs were inspired by local places, like Strawberry Fields, the Salvation Army home near to where John Lennon lived, and Penny Lane, stripped of dozens of street signs by souvenir hunters from all over the world.
During the decade that they were together, the Beatles had bigger record sales than any other musical act, and Bill Hamilton looks back on a success story that has now come to a tragic end.
For John Lennon, this is where it began, a dingy basement club in Liverpool. By the late 50s, the nucleus of the Beatles was established, but at that stage singing other people's songs.
Beatles were then just four lads on that rather dimly lit stage, somewhat ill-clad, and the presentation was, well, left a little to be desired as far as I was concerned, because I'd been interested in the theatre and acting for a long time. But amongst all that, something tremendous came over.
By 1963, Beatlemania was sweeping across Britain. Wherever they went, the Beatles were acclaimed with a kind of enthusiasm which bordered on frenzy, and their earthy, good-humoured appeal also won over some of the older generation. In the age of flower power, the Beatles appeared on the first worldwide television satellite. Apart from his outstanding musical talents, Lennon will be remembered for being a cult figure of the 60s and 70s. Lennon's last interview was with Radio 1 DJ Andy Peebles, who was in America to record part of his Christmas show.
We're pretty damn steady, I'd say. That we're in good condition. Thank you very much. It's great to talk to you, and it's not kindness. We want to sell the record, and we want to talk to the English too.
Now, the rest of the news.
I'm Bill Vitka from The Source, and John Lennon is dead at the age of 40, the apparent victim of what New York City police call a screwball with a gun. Lennon was on his way back from a New York City recording studio, the record plant. He left the studio around 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Lennon and Yoko Ono were both in their limousine as it pulled up at the Dakotas, the Lennon's apartment building on the Upper West Side of New York City. Between the car and the front door of the Dakota, Lennon was shot at close range. Apparently he took 7 bullets in the chest. He was taken by the police to nearby Roosevelt Hospital. Source correspondent C.D. Jaco talked to some of the police who were with Lennon, and they told him that Lennon was still conscious, still alive at that point. They asked him if he was John Lennon, and he said yes, he was. But at the hospital, Lennon was too badly injured for anybody to do anything, and Lennon was pronounced dead around 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time. A little while after that, Dr. Stephen Lind at Roosevelt Hospital told reporters there was nothing anyone could do.
John Lennon was brought to the emergency room of the Roosevelt site, St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, this evening, shortly before 11 p.m. He was dead on arrival. Extensive resuscitative efforts were made, but in spite of transfusions and many procedures, he could not be resuscitated.
The death of anyone is a tragedy, but the death of John Lennon, a man who influenced an entire generation through the Beatles and through his solo career, takes on special meaning. The irony of Lennon's death is that he had just returned to public life after a 6-year sabbatical, back to the recording studio to make the record Double Fantasy with Yoko Ono. In fact, Monday night, just before his death, Lennon was working on a new single that should have been mastered on Tuesday. Outside outside the Dakota, Lennon's apartment building. At the scene of the shooting, a de facto memorial service appears to be underway with an estimated 200 people in a total state of shock. And that's news. I'm Bill Vitka from The Source.
And this is WNEW-FM in New York. This is WNEW-FM in New York. I'm Vin Skelsa. Mona Rivera from WNEW-FM News is in the vicinity of the Dakota. Is that correct, Mona?
Yes, that's where I am.
You're on the air right now.
Okay, Vin, outside the Dakota, the crowds have grown even more. I would say there's at least 400 people milling around at 72nd Street and Central Park West. The police are having a hard time keeping traffic moving, but they are attempting. Just a short while ago, Chief of Detectives for the Manhattan Borough, James Sullivan, came out of the Dakota. He had just finished surveying the scene. He had just talked with witnesses and with several of the policemen who had responded earlier when John Lennon was shot, and he told reporters what had happened. At the very beginning of this tape, which I'm about to play for you, the first words he's saying, which are kind of off mic, are John Lennon and his wife had just returned from a recording studio. I'll let him take it from there.
Yoko Ono had returned from a recording studio and had alighted from a limousine at this point. We're not sure if the limousine was inside the driveway or if it was outside on the street. They went into a little vestibule inside, and as he was walking through the vestibule, this individual, who is unidentified at this point but will be identified soon, fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber Charter Arms pistol. Mr. Lennon was struck several times. We're not positive at this time as to how many times he was struck. He went up the stairs. There are 5 steps that lead up into the watchman's area of the Dakota. He went through that area into an office inside, where he collapsed to the floor. A radio car responded to this location and took him to Roosevelt Hospital, where he expired. Right now, I'm going to go to the station house and talk to some of the witnesses and see if we can put some more details together so that we can give you a fuller account as quickly as we can. It appears at this time that the individual is from out of town, possibly Hawaii. That's the way it looks at the moment.
Was he a screwball? What was at the time? Words exchange.
I haven't spoken to the witnesses at this point. I can't tell you that. No, she was not. No, I think he's a male white.
How long had he been hanging around here?
We don't know that. Some people say a couple of days, but we're checking that out also. We're not sure.
Had he been reported before as a threat?
Not to my knowledge.
So there you have it then. That is Chief of Detectives James Sullivan at the Dakota, where he interviewed police officers regarding what had happened to John Lennon. As you heard earlier, when Robin Sagan and I reported from the hospital, John died of significant injuries of the major vessels inside his chest. This man apparently knew where he was aiming, and he aimed at his chest, and there was massive blood loss, and he was dead on arrival at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital. And that's the scene from the Dakota. I'm Mona Rivera.
Mona?
Yes.
Several hundred people are at the Dakota right now. Is that correct?
Yes, and Vin, the atmosphere there has even increased, perhaps, in terms of the grief and some people are there crying. There are others who are playing radios, and one gentleman who I went over to who had a portable radio and was just sitting on the sidewalk blasting his radio with Beatles music, and I shook him a few times and I attempted to interview him to see how he would feel, and others waved me away and said, don't even go near him, he won't talk, he's catatonic. And others are walking around just totally in grief, and the crowds just seem to be growing.
You would describe this as a vigil?
It is definitely a vigil.
Okay. Thanks, Mona.
Okay.
Talk to you later. This is WNEW-FM in New York. Throughout the night here, we've been opening up the phone lines to you. A lot of us just seem to have thoughts that we want to share with one another, and I think that's a valid use of the airwaves here at 102.7 to turn them over to you and let you say your piece. So if you'd like to give us a call at 212-955 or just 9629,
I was down there earlier at the Dakota right after I heard about it. I had gone home from
Avery Fisher a little earlier than everybody else, and was just getting into bed, and someone called and told me what happened, and I thought, well, I'll go to the Dakota and see what I can see. And I saw people who didn't know each other, 300 or 400 of them, standing there, silently, watching the Dakota. It's not very nice there, because there's blood on the sidewalk, and there's bullet holes in the guard booth. And one of the eyewitnesses who was there said that she heard shouting right after she heard shots, and the shouting was Yoko calling for help. The man was collared immediately. Another eyewitness told me that the guy seemed to be crouching in the shadows, waiting for John to be there, and he had been seen in the neighborhood all week long. New York City police are being very, very careful about what they say about this man, who he is, how old he is, where he came from, what he was up to. They're saying, and this is a quote from a New York City policeman at the scene, "This case is as important to us as the assassination of John F. Kennedy."
That's quite amazing. This is WNEW-FM in New York. A friend of ours who was also a staffer over at the New York Times is at the hotel. Kevin, at the hospital. Kevin Goldman?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Kevin. You're on the air.
They're about, right now...
Kevin, where are you right now?
I am outside Roosevelt Hospital's emergency room at 58th Street, a phone booth, 58th Street and 9th Avenue, at about 1:11 this morning. A mortuary truck pulled up and into the emergency parking lot, and just 2 seconds ago pulled out, and police confirmed that the body of John Lennon is in there. And outside the hospital now, and this is what I wanted to sort of tell your listeners, is that as much as, you want to come by, there is no real point. Like, there are police here to keep you away. The crowd, which was at the most, the height, which was about a half hour to 45 minutes ago, about 200 people, some like openly weeping behind sunglasses and crying, talking about their experiences and playing guitars and everything, has dwindled down to, I'd say, about 50. And there was a little bit of traffic now, and traffic's flowing smoothly on 9th Avenue. So, there's no real point in coming by. It has even ceased, being a media event, which is at its most horror. That's what it was. And even the television crews are packing. I mean, John Lennon's body, again, about 3 seconds ago, just went down 9th Avenue in that mortuary division truck. And Yoko is gone, and has left the hospital. So I just wanted to sort of tell listeners, as much as you want to come by, there is no real reason to come by.
Okay, Kevin.
Okay, Vin?
Yeah, thank you very much.